All right, so it's 5:40, so we can get started. My name is Melanie McCormick, and my colleague and great friend Brittany Jones and I will be presenting tonight. We are very excited to present Teaching to Preserve K-12 Students' Cultural Identities through Social Studies and Literacy. We really would like this to be an interactive experience where we can all learn from each other and share resources. So if you have any questions or comments, just feel free to ask or put them in the chat box. Tonight, you will need something to write on and write with, and then we'll also be utilizing Jamboard. So our agenda, Brittany and I will introduce ourselves so you can learn a little bit more about us. Then we will do a warm-up activity. We'll talk about what the research is saying, and then we're going to explore some strategies and resources. So I'm Melanie. I'm a doctoral student at Michigan State in the Curriculum Instruction and Teacher Education program. I am interested in studying early childhood and elementary, especially early elementary, social studies and literacy. And I am also a former kindergarten and first grade teacher in Ann Arbor Public Schools.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Jones. I'm happy to be here with you all and to be in conversation with you. So I, too, am a doctoral student at Michigan State University in the Curriculum Instruction and Teacher Education program. My research interests focused around anti-racist social studies education, both in K-12 education, but in public historical spaces as well. And I'm a former high school social studies teacher from Richmond, Virginia.
So for our warm-up activity, please pick 3 aspects of your personal identity and you can write them down on a piece of paper. And then we're going to use those for our Jamboard. So they can be any aspects of your identity that you would like to choose. So for example, I could write Korean American, adoptee, and woman, but you can choose any aspects of your identity. And then we will give you a minute to do that, and then we'll move to the Jamboard. So children can perceive themselves as inferior to the dominant groups and lose their cultural identities when they are taught by a teacher who has a different cultural identity than them. So we want you to look back at what aspects you wrote about your own identity and think to yourself, do you feel like those aspects connect to your students? And in our Jamboard, on the first page, we will answer if you don't feel like the aspects of your identity connect to your students, what are some ways that you feel like you could connect to their cultural identities? And if they do, what are some ways you could expand their knowledge about other identities? So I'm noticing some really great answers, and it's just so important that as educators that we do this type of identity work and think about how our identities can impact our students and think about like what biases we hold, because oftentimes we're not given a lot of time to do identity work with all the demands of teaching. So we just wanted to take this time to do a warm up for us to get thinking about how our experiences can also impact our students as well. So thank you for participating in that Jamboard.
All right, so we're going to move on to Melanie's point about identity. I just want to reiterate that identity is one of those things that it's a continuous thing. Like we'll always be working on identity, how that influences our work, particularly as educators. So it's not a one-time, one and done type of activity where, okay, we've thought about our identity and we got it, we're moving on. No, it's something that we're constantly looking at because over time, you know, our identity is malleable, it's always changing. And so it's always going to influence ourselves, but also our students as well. So moving on to what the research is saying about student identity, representation, literacy, anti-racist social studies. We'll be covering it all tonight. Thank you. Okay, so thinking about student identity and representation. So we know that students have many aspects of their identities that teachers can represent in their classrooms. But too often, the identities of our students, particularly when they're different from our own, are not represented. And that could be detrimental to our students' learning. We know that schools can be sites for identity development. And when children feel isolated at school and when they feel like they're not represented, when they feel like they're not seen, they can become disengaged and they feel like they can't achieve their goals. So when students see themselves in the work, also when they see themselves in the teacher, they become, research suggests that they become more engaged in the work that they do. So the use of culturally sustaining pedagogy. So this is a term, in the education field, it stems from culturally relevant pedagogy. So we're advocating for the use of culturally sustaining pedagogies in our social studies classroom because we know that it can address the needs of all students. Paris and Aline, they talk about how culturally sustaining pedagogies allows for a fluid understanding of culture and a teacher practice that explicitly engages questions of equity and justice. So in our presentation, not only are we thinking about how we can increase the ways in which students are represented and see themselves in the work that we do, but then how can we go a step further to make sure that our work is fighting for equity and justice? Culturally sustaining pedagogies also addresses and acknowledges the funds of cultural knowledge that students bring to the classroom. Again, we know that students don't come to the classroom just with an empty mind. They have cultural knowledge, they see things on TV, they've experienced things, and they bring all of that. They bring their whole selves to the classroom. So the questions that we really need to be asking ourselves is, how are we making sure that we're teaching the whole student? And one way we can do this is through culturally sustaining pedagogies. So again, we know that students bring to the classroom tons of knowledge, funds of knowledge. And so we need to ask ourselves, what asset-based practices are we using to uplift these funds of knowledge that students are bringing to the classroom? Because sometimes when students bring identities that are different than our own, we don't think of them as asset-based, but as deficit-based. We see this a lot through language ideologies. When students come to the classroom and they speak a different language at home, sometimes teachers think that's something that's bad, when in actuality, these students have a much larger vocabulary than monolingual children. So our next question to you, and feel free to write in the chat or to unmute yourself if you are so moved. But we want to think about, what are some of the cultural funds of knowledge that students have brought to your own classrooms? And can you name some asset-based practices that you've used to uplift their cultural funds of knowledge? So we'll just take some time. Again, feel free to write in the chat or unmute yourself if you like. Thanks so much, Colton. That's so great. I think when we think about language, it's so important to uplift the languages that our students are bringing to our classroom. Yeah, so that's excellent. Thank you.
So in the chat, I can reiterate what we're doing. So we're just asking to write in the chat or unmute yourself if you would like. What are some cultural funds of knowledge that students have brought to your classroom? Or can you name some asset-based practices that uplift their cultural funds of knowledge?
One thing that we've done well before the pandemic was we have two of them ELL students in my class, and they actually brought the cultural foods in and explained how it came to be, when they would use this type of food for celebration or during a religious time, what they did for their holidays. Like for Christmas, they would bring in a Christmas dish that they would have at their dinner table, and explained how it is at their house during Christmas time. So then the students would know, hey, this is what their culture is like compared to what ours is.
Thank you for sharing. So I just recently read an article by a professor that Brittany and I work closely with, Dr. Pat Edwards, and her suggestion for EL students was to reframe sharing time, especially since sharing time happens very commonly in elementary classrooms, and inviting parents in to share artifacts from home and share about culture. And what her research found was that when students were sharing about their culture, they were actually more inquisitive at home about learning more about their native culture. So I thought that was a really interesting study. And one important point with that study was that as teachers, we need to make things really clear for families, especially EL families. So she put together a calendar and very clear, concise directions with modeling and visuals so that families and students could work together on it and understand what the task was. All right. So next,
Hold on, Melanie.
oh,
There's a couple of things popping up in the chat.
sorry about
So
that.
Heather shared her story about Ash Wednesday, and that provoked students to ask about why she had the ashes. Nicholas talked about, I have a student in my economics course who was born in El Salvador, and we talked about the difference in currency, which is great. That's really great for social studies too, right? Like civics. And Allison, at my school growing up, we had a culture day where we had food and brought things from home and performance exhibitions. I love that and always wanted to bring that to any school I go to. All of these are great. I'm excited that we are doing things and implementing pedagogies that are uplifting our students' culture.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing, everyone. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about interdisciplinary social studies and literacy and how that can be really impactful for this type of work. So using children's literature can improve the learning of social studies content. So for example, using interactive read alouds or different writing tasks can really improve the learning of social studies content knowledge. Research also shows that interdisciplinary social studies and literacy can create authentic learning opportunities for students, which is really important for their engagement and also giving students agency in the classroom. And recently, a study came out that you may have seen on Edutopia from the Fordham Institute that stated that social studies is the only subject with clear, positive, and statistically significant effect on reading improvement. So we want to be really transparent that there are some concerns with this study and the methods that they used, and we really need to further research this topic. But what Brittany and I really appreciated was that social studies was coming into the spotlight as being really beneficial in classrooms. And often classrooms don't have enough time for social studies instruction. So we just really appreciated how this was putting some focus on the positive impacts of social studies and the positive impacts it can have on literacy in the classroom. So interdisciplinary social studies and literacy instruction can focus on multiple perspectives so that all students can feel a sense of belonging, agency, and shape their identities in authentic ways. We really want and need our students to feel represented in the classroom because research shows how important that is. Some studies have shown that students have greater reading comprehension when they do feel represented and connected to the text that they read or that are read to them. So it's really important that we're deliberate in the ways that we use literacy to instruct in social studies. Students can draw personal connections through literacy, for example, through interactive read alouds again, or book clubs. So as a former elementary school teacher, I often used read alouds to drive social studies instruction or just to supplement the curriculum. And this could be a really effective way to help students connect to the content. So for example, in elementary school, many schools use the expanding communities approach. So they are making connections to their self, their families, the school, and then the broader communities that they are part of. So we can really use literacy to drive those connections to those different aspects. Um, and literature can be used as a way to show children mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So, mirrors to see themselves, windows to develop an understanding of others, and sliding glass doors to transverse between diverse groups. So, in the chat box, I was wondering if you have any books that you like to utilize with your students to teach social studies. And then we can share some resources in the chat box because it's always great to have book suggestions. I know I'm always up for suggestions for books. Currently, I'm writing some social studies curriculum, and finding books can be one of the most challenging tasks for social studies, I think. So yeah, any books you want to share, feel free to just keep sharing throughout the presentation. But I will move on right now. So social studies and content literacy can impact the development of students' skills to participate in a democratic society. And this research really connects well with the National Council for the Social Studies C3 framework standards. Um, Research has also shown that writing about content can improve learning in social studies. So some examples of this include writing with graphical representations, writing about the social studies content that the kids are learning about, and then reflection writing has been shown to be really effective as well. So I want us to think of some ways that you incorporate literacy into your social studies instruction, or some ways that you would like to try in the future. We can share our ideas on page 2 of our Jamboard. So there is a little arrow at the top that you can scroll over. And then Brittany just put in the link again. We just want this to be a place that you can come back and use this link and explore different options. And there are a lot of options that can really span K-12. For example, Brittany and I wrote an article about using oral histories in K-12 classrooms, and that's a really great way to incorporate speaking and listening skills, writing skills, and history as well, and making those connections to identity. So you can do it with families or community members.
I noted in the chat while you all are writing that March, it's a comic book, but made for high school. It's about John Lewis, and his life is a great resource for high school.
Definitely using articles and using the news to teach literacy skills as well as social studies. There's a lot of great research out there right now about news literacy that is really impactful, and we can teach our students to better comprehend the news and better understand sources as well through that.
Okay, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit. So we've been talking about identity and we've been talking about literacy, but we really wanna shift our focus to anti-racist pedagogies and identity in a social studies classroom and what that looks like. And so when we're thinking about anti-racist pedagogies, I just want to be clear that anti-racist is different from non-racist. And the difference is in the action. So I just want to make that clear because that's what the literature says. When we're trying to implement these pedagogies, we're moving beyond being just non-racist to being anti-racist. So what that looks like, the first tenet is that an anti-racist teacher will reject the notions of human difference. So no one racial group is superior or more intelligent than the other. Secondly, an anti-racist acknowledges that even though racial categories are social constructs, so even though being white or Black or Latinx or Asian are these social constructs, we recognize that these lived experiences are shaped around race and racism backed by history. So people, in this way, anti-racists recognize how racial group identities have been affected by various systems of injustice. Third, anti-racism promotes learning from diverse forms of knowledge and experience. So an anti-racist teacher is going to implement multiple perspectives and ideas. But the difference between a multicultural teacher and an anti-racist teacher is number 4. So an anti-racist teacher is going to challenge systems of racial inequality in their lessons as well. So we just want to set that stage for us as we begin to think about how then can we take this theory about anti-racist pedagogies and put that into practice into our classrooms, our social studies classrooms. All right, so connection between anti-racist pedagogies and identity. So we know as teachers, the stories we both tell and the stories we research in social studies instruction matter. It matters because our students need to see themselves in the instruction for that identity. But we also know that too often historical narratives, particularly in social studies, are told through a white Eurocentric hegemonic lens. And so when we teach social studies through a white gaze, it oftentimes erases the identities of students who do not identify as white. And students of color may implicitly learn that their culture, that the culture of the dominant group is superior to theirs. But also when white students are only learning about whiteness, it distorts how they see the world as well. So how then can we use anti-racist pedagogies to prevent erasure? So that's erasure of non-white students and their identities in social studies classrooms. So if we begin to shift our teaching towards implementing anti-racist pedagogies when teaching social studies, we can start to affirm all of the students in our classrooms and all of our students' identities. So again, just coming back to those tenets of anti-racist pedagogies, we know it rejects the notion of human difference. And we know that though race is a social construct, lived experiences shape race and racism, and it's backed by history. But one way to address racism in your social studies classroom is to include multiple perspectives. We know this, folks have shared this in the chat and on the Jam boards, but an anti-racist teacher is not gonna stop there. An anti-racist teacher is not going to just say, okay, we've done different people's perspectives and ideas and identities. An anti-racist teacher is going to go a step further. The anti-racist teacher is gonna have conversations with their students about why some identities have even been left out of historical narratives. Questioning why some folks have been erased, why they're only mentioned, while other cultures are talked about all throughout the year. And in doing this, you're acknowledging how race and racism have historical roots. I also want to point out that these conversations can be had in high school and middle school and elementary school as well, because we know that all students, whether it's elementary or high school, come to the classroom with some type of funds of knowledge. So we need to, as teachers, acknowledge that as well. Again, when we begin to shift our teaching towards implementing anti-racist pedagogies, you can click the next piece. So when we're including multiple perspectives, social studies educators also need to acknowledge that racial inequalities are not something that happens just in the present, nor are they something that happens in isolation, but rather there's a long history that shapes present racial inequalities. So for example, given the anti-Blackness that we experienced in 2020 and police shootings, a non-racist teacher would say, oh, that's sad that someone got shot, and keep it moving. An anti-racist educator would say police shootings and police brutality against Black folks is not something that's isolated in 2020, but it has a long history tied to the conception of the United States. And you would explain the inequalities from there. And you can do that with all marginalized groups. So given this, as an anti-racist social studies educator, we need to be prepared to recognize the various ways that our students' identities are shaped by the present and the past, and how we can question inequality, power, and oppression in our social studies classrooms. So, given that quick tidbit about anti-racist pedagogies, and as Melanie and I are former teachers and we go to professional developments or conferences, we always like to hear these things about anti-racist theories and blah, blah, blah. But we as teachers are always craving like, okay, well, that's cool, but how can I implement that in my classroom tomorrow, right? Like teachers, I understand, we wanna know how we can implement that in our classrooms. So let's think about it. So how might you transform one of your social studies lessons so that they include an anti-racist pedagogy? How can you shift a lesson from being non-racist or perhaps just multicultural to anti-racist? And a starting point may be to ask yourself, from whose perspective is this story, narrative, read aloud being told? So we're not asking you to write in the chat or the Jamboard or out loud, but this is kind of more of a reflective piece that you can think about of how you can move your social studies lessons from where they are to an anti-racist stance.
Sorry, I was muted. So next we are going to share some strategies to incorporate and some resources, and we'll have some time to explore those. So some strategies that you can incorporate are inquiry-based projects, project-based learning, oral histories, interactive read-alouds, book clubs, reflective journals. If you can think of some strategies to incorporate, you can feel free to share on the third page of the Jamboard. And then some resources. So these are some of the resources that we like to use. So Learning for Justice, which was formerly known as Teaching Tolerance, is a great resource. They actually have standards that you can incorporate in your social studies lessons that can address diversity, justice, action, identity. So those are great to look at when you are planning. And they have banded standards similar to the C3 framework. So K2, 3, 5, and then so on and so forth. Socialjusticebooks.org is an amazing site that has so many book resources, and they categorize them, and they give little descriptions as well. So definitely check that out. On Instagram, we really enjoy We Need Diverse Books and The Conscious Kid. And then there's two Facebook teacher groups that are really great too. So Teaching Race and Racism's A Critical Approach, and the CREST Critical Resources for Elementary School Social Studies Teacher Facebook groups are great. And teachers can ask questions about lessons or share different resources. So it's a great group to be added to. And then the National Council for the Social Studies, they have really great readings, and you can find the C3 standards there. And if you join, then you can get access to some of their journals, and they have great practitioner journals. And what Brittany and I love about those are you as a teacher can read them and think about like, what can I implement in my classroom tomorrow? And we think that's really important for research to do. And then Brittany and I we will be launching our own Instagram. It's at Anti-Racism for Kids. And we'll be sharing resources, teaching tips, giving some historical information and things like that. So we really want to engage with the teaching community, because although we are graduate students, we are really teachers at heart. So we always want to be connected to the schools and teachers. So right now, I'd like to ask you to look at one of these resources that you're not familiar with, and then you can share in the chat or you can share out loud something that you like about the resource or something that you're wondering as well.
Or if you just have any questions about what we talked about today, feel free to ask in the chat or to unmute yourself. We have about 9 minutes left.
Yep.
Yeah.
We also have one more thing to share with you that we're working on. So Brittany and I, we have been working on a anti-racist book for students to use in the classroom or at home, and we wanted to share 2 pages from our book with you. So we want to teach kids to become critical thinkers about different types of racism that can occur. So the page that you can see right now is about stereotyping. So when you look at this page, you can think to yourself, how would you as a teacher implement this in your classroom? So the first page, they're going to think, learn, and then consider. And then the second page that I'll show in a minute will be an anti-racist reflection page for the students to utilize. So I'll give you a minute to take a look at this, and feel free to ask any questions to us as well.
Also want to note that we created this book with early L in mind. So it's catered to that age group.
That's a great idea to make something like this for SEL, because social emotional learning is so important, especially we're seeing how necessary it is with the students going to school through a pandemic right now. So yeah.
Like we have issues right now going on with all of our 6th grade kids, and it's not just like this would help. Like I could even use this tomorrow in class because of the way of their high behaviors right now, but it's more of the kind of going one ear out the other right now with them. So it's like no matter how hard you try to teach them or preach to them about being kind, being nice, respectful, all that stuff, it's just they're not grasping it right now. They'd rather be mean or torturous, I guess you could say, to other kids and not thinking about how the other person might be feeling. So like I said, I could even use this tomorrow morning and add to it. But that's why I asked if there was anything like this for like an SEL.
I'm not sure about resource specifically, but I would suggest looking into transformative social emotional learning. There's some really great research out there right now about it, and it's just a different way of looking at social emotional learning, and it lends itself really well with culturally relevant pedagogies as well. So I'll scroll to the next page. So this would be the anti-racist reflection on stereotyping. So we really want the students to use that critical lens when looking at different types of racism. And since we only have 4 minutes left, please feel free to ask us any questions, or if you have any comments. We are so open to that. And I can share our emails. 1 second.
Yeah, so this text, we are finishing up this book. So we showed you a page from it and we're finishing it up. So it will be available. I'm pretty sure we'll post it on our Instagram.
And feel free to email us. So jonesb85@MSU is Brittany's email, and then McCord158@MSU is me, Melanie.
We're happy to talk about culturally relevant pedagogies, sustaining anti-racist pedagogies, social justice, social studies, we're all about that. So feel free to reach out.
Yes. We really appreciate everyone coming and participating on the Jamboard and in the chat.
Yep, and we hope that you took something away from this. Thank you all so much.